have a confession to make. Silent Hill Homecoming was my first Silent Hill game. Growing up, I only ever had Nintendo consoles, meaning I didn't have chance to experience a lot of the PlayStation 2 classic titles until much later in life, my early 20s to be specific, when I finally managed to get a copy of a PS2 and hunt down the games that I've been trying to play for years. Since then, I've spent a while catching up on games that either aren't preserved online, on various online gaming services, or catching up on those that have been crudely ripped from those online services and replaced with inferior versions. But as far as Silent Hill is concerned, my first foray into the franchise was picking up Homecoming after months of saving up pocket money for an Xbox 360. I think I was 16 or 17 at the time, although you'll have to forgive me if I'm wrong because I am very old these days. Anyway, at the time I actually thought it was okay, nothing spectacular, but certainly not the worst game I'd ever played. That said, I had very little to compare it to, given that at that point in time I only owned around 40 games in total across 3 different consoles. My survival horror staple was still the Resident Evil remake, and I vastly preferred it, but I do recall thinking at the time, yeah, I kinda see why people like Silent Hill. Bless my soul, I was young and naive. And in 2012, when I had considerably more spare cash lying around, both Silent Hill Downpour and the HD collection were released. I'd still not played the original games at that point, so I picked up both Downpour and the HD collection and settled myself in. I'd heard the discontent surrounding the HD ports, but with nothing to compare them to, I found that I enjoyed both games, especially the seminal Silent Hill 2. Then I played Downpour. My god, Downpour was bad. If you played this game at launch, then you will likely remember how horribly broken it was. Screen tearing, lag, input delay, frame drops, it had it all. There was a faint trace of a decent game somewhere within the technical issues, but by the time it was patched, I'd already finished the game and moved on. I've played it a few times since then, and at this point I'm mostly just lukewarm. It wasn't until much later on, when I'd finally purchased a PS2 and original copies of the Team Silent games, that I finally understood why folks hated the HD collection. If you have any intention of playing Silent Hill 2 and 3, do not play the HD collection unless you literally have no other choice. There are many unnecessary changes that detract from the experience of both games, and Silent Hill 3's HD port was compiled from bits and pieces of the original game because Konami did not archive their own damn code and so had to provide the porting studio with an incomplete version. This is the reason why the voice acting was fully redone for 3, without you having the option to play with the original voices the way that you could with the second game, as well as the technical issues present in both games, some of which Team Silent themselves originally fixed, but because the code provided was not the published game, Hijinx Studios had to fix previously resolved problems whilst also coping with the new issues that arose during development. To put it politely, it was a travesty. So, to preface, in case you're not familiar with the history of Silent Hill, the series can be neatly divided into 2 categories: original developers Team Silent's games, and not Team Silent games. Everything after Silent Hill 4 was created by Western developers of varying degrees of talent and lack thereof, with some being far more egregious and noticeable than others. Silent Hill Homecoming is a product of the latter. Released in North America in September 2008 for home consoles, followed by a PC port a week later, it wasn't until February the following year that it was released in the EU. Homecoming was the 3rd game created by someone other than Team Silent, being developed by American company Double Helix, who, at the time, had never developed a game before, not as Double Helix at least, although they were formed as part of a merger between 2 previous companies, one of whom was Shiny Entertainment. You know, the guys who made Enter the Matrix. Quite how Konami decided on them is anyone's guess, but I assume it's because they were cheap and Konami had long since stopped giving a shit about their IPs. It was the last game in the franchise to feature music by longtime franchise composer Akira Yamaoka, and it is the only Silent Hill game that has never been released in Japan. Reviews at the time were fairly middling, although it still garnered average reviews of around the 6.5 to 7 out of 10 mark, which is about right for the standard of the time, even if I disagree with how reflective this is of the game itself. It isn't dismal, But much like the Thief reboot, it just isn't a good franchise game. It either utterly disregards established staples of the series and genre as a whole, fixed camera angles, intricate and difficult puzzles, a dark and moody atmosphere informed by the characters who inhabit it, or it takes aspects from other Silent Hill media, specifically the 2005 Christoph Gans film, and crams them in for fan service with no real understanding of precisely how horror works, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to make it clear that I'm going to be talking about the game in general with regards to what went wrong, but the footage will be of the PC version, which is important in the sense that this is quite possibly the single worst PC port I have ever played. It took 8 attempts to get the game to load past the start menu. It has input lag, frame drops, is unstable at anything above standard HD resolutions, has sound issues including but not limited to lip sync problems, static bursts, broken surround sound, with some things being too loud and some being too quiet, and many, many more.
Joshua, is that you?
I'm busy. Go away.
What are you doing here?
I want my toy.
Judge Holloway, can I ask you a question?
Sure, Alex. What is it?
The town seems empty. All the stores are closed or boarded up. What's going on?
It's complicated, Alex.
It can and will crash at random, and is almost 100% guaranteed to crash if you Alt-Tab out of the game. You can use a controller if you like, but the game will still only display keyboard prompts whose colour don't match the controller button that it's supposed to be mapped to anyway. You can dodge, but the input delay likes to straddle your dodge key. Iframes exist, but don't necessarily do what they're told when they're told. You can and will be stun-locked out of existence, although you can also stun-lock the enemies for a refreshing change. Areas are incredibly linear with no real incentive to explore. The fog moves in a straight line in front of you and the game likes to hitch. My god, this port hitches. I lost count of the number of times I was sure that my game would crash as it hung there immobile for 5 to 20 seconds at a time. It seems to happen the most when the game is supposed to be loading something in the background in preparation for a cutscene or a new area, but something fucks up. Or I suppose more appropriately, everything fucks up, and the game just hangs there like a particularly laggy puppet. It is deeply impressive just how broken this PC port is, and you are going to suffer through it with me. It's worth mentioning though, if it makes you feel better, the console version, from what I recall, runs just fine. These issues are almost entirely limited to the PC version, but the character models are still terrifying no matter what platform you play it on. There are a number of reasons why Silent Hill fans aren't particularly sweet on Homecoming, and it's less to do with the developers being Westerners and just not understanding Silent Hill, because both Origins and Shattered Memories are far more highly regarded, despite both being developed by Western devs Climax Studios. Granted, Origins has its flaws and it certainly has its detractors, but it is nowhere near as despised as Homecoming is. Origins maintained the series' traditions, fixed angles, tight claustrophobic areas, incentivised exploration, and so on and so forth. It was criticised for treading familiar ground with the first game's cult story, breaking canon with the original face of a lesser Gillespie, and featuring Pyramid Head in a different t-shirt, but the game is still a valiant effort by developers who learned from their mistakes and went on to create the genuinely engaging and fascinating Shattered Memories, a game with which I have a complicated relationship. Essentially, Homecoming's biggest problem is this. It is a generic third-person action game lumbered with the Silent Hill label, and as a result it feels obliged to throw in a few series staples in an attempt to convince people that it isn't just a knockoff Resident Evil wearing the skin of its namesake. So let's dismantle this game piece by piece and discuss the glaring flaws and, shockingly, the things that I do really like about this game. Namely that it's quite short. Silent Hill Homecoming casts you as Alex Shepard, a soldier returning home after spending time in the hospital for an unspecified injury. During his hitchhike home, he experiences a nightmare in which he tries to reach his younger brother, Joshua, throughout a twisted version of a hospital. Every so often, Pyramid Head pops by to say hello with his giant muscly arms and dirty butcher rags, and there are even a handful of sexy nurses to bother you as you make your way through the dilapidated hellscape. Oh, and there are these little bug things that you have to button mash to throw them off if they latch onto you. When he wakes, Alex is dropped off at the entry to Shepherd's Glen, a town founded by his own ancestors, amongst others. Things are quite clearly not going particularly well for the once industrious town. It's blanketed in a thick fog and there are horrific monstrosities roaming the streets. Alex returns home to find his mother traumatised, monsters in his basement, and his brother and father missing. The lion's share of the game revolves around chasing down leads for each of the other founders' descendants, the mayor, the judge, and the doctor, in an attempt to figure out what happened to Joshua. Each lead takes him to another version of a twisted otherworld of sorts, wherein Alex must fight for his life against a series of rather messed up bosses and beasties, all in aid of seeking out his... spoilers, by the way. Definitely not dead brother. Realistically, if you are at all shocked by the quote-unquote twist of Silent Hill Homecoming, I truly feel for you, because this game does not even attempt to try to obfuscate its story in any meaningful way. It becomes clear very early on that Alex is a touch on the delusional side, although quite why nobody ever actually says anything to this degree to him, despite every single other adult left alive in Shepherd's Glen knowing exactly what has caused the problems they're facing, is just not a question worth asking because the game never answers it. Like previous games, Homecoming does have a relatively simple premise, though it is largely weighed down by tangents and mechanical decisions that detract from the overall experience. The decision to set the majority of the game within Shepherd's Glen is a puzzling one, given the fact that the town's design, especially when smothered in fog, is functionally identical to Silent Hill, making the setting of the game completely worthless. It being a neighbouring town with a dark and corrupted history of crazy cults hardly separates it from Silent Hill in the way that the developers probably intended to, and as a result you're liable to forget that you're not in the titular town within the first 10 minutes of the game. Since you can't see much of the Glen and the few areas you can access are blanketed in fog, it has next to nothing beyond its name to set it apart from its predecessors, and as a result brings nothing new to the table. It's also an incredibly small map with only around 6 streets actually accessible and very few opportunities to really explore and engage with the world. Where there might previously have been flavour text to spice up the lore and background of the Glen, much of this has been relegated to exposition that happens in the other world instead, if it happens at all, leaving no value to the town above. Because of this, exploring is basically worthless, and in combination with the irritating monsters and the terrible combat, it is also an exercise in frustration, but more on that later. So, beyond being set somewhere else but having no attempt at a distinct visual style unlike Silent Hill 4, what else does Homecoming do wrong? Lots. Lots and lots. In terms of essentially every major aspect of a typical Silent Hill game, even including Origins, Homecoming either disregards or tangles them up with typical third-person action genre tropes of the time. It features an over-the-shoulder camera rather than the fixed angles of previous entries, and its movement and combat system has been updated to match. It's likely that the camera was swapped to the more typical style due to the fact that, as our favourite edgelord puts it,
I mean, Alex from Silent Hill Homecoming combat rolling around the misty streets like Sonic the fucking Hedgehog was just dumb.
Being a soldier, Alex has a wider array of movement available to him compared to past protagonists. He can roll, dodge, duck and weave, and combo enemies to death. This control style wouldn't work with fixed angles, since the greatest asset of Silent Hill's oppressive atmosphere was its minimalist movement and tank controls, where your character is an everyman who stumbles into the jaws of death. Alex, on the other hand, is absolutely definitely 100% a highly trained military man, and so the updated control scheme makes perfect sense. Listen, I've made no secret of the fact that I dislike this game and I think it has a lot of faults, but the fact of the matter is that this was the first Silent Hill game I ever played, and for all its problems, I actually don't hate it. Especially upon replaying it for this video. Despite how obnoxious the performance was, I wouldn't say that I actively enjoyed the game, but I didn't feel like I was wasting my time. Which is to say that Homecoming's problems are less to do with it being outright bad and more just the fact that it is utterly and completely average. It is an incredibly average game with some elements of pleasing graphical fidelity, for a mid-2000s game at least. It has average combat and average characters, none of whom are distinct enough to really care about, but are all reasonably well voice acted and somewhat resemble what I imagine real human beings to be like after a fashion. They don't always act the way that you might expect people to act, but we'll get to that. Like many games that attempt to emulate the distinct feel of late 90s and early 2000s horror games, the greatest trick that Homecoming pulls is convincing you that it knows what horror is. It knows that Silent Hill has fog, so it too has plenty of fog, it just doesn't understand why it's there. It knows Silent Hill has monsters, but it doesn't know that the monsters were both representations of the psyche of the suffering party within Silent Hill, and were often sculpted to stand out as being particularly visceral, whilst still feeling as though they truly belonged in the world of Silent Hill. It's less that these monsters were fashioned from the town itself, the way that, for example, Alessian looks like it was moulded by the forest, and more that they were created from the heart of Silent Hill itself. They are nightmares given form specifically to make the journey torturous, arduous, and unpleasant. But what Homecoming does wrong in every other department is the same thing that many horror games get wrong even to this day. Jump scares, ugly orange darkness, and basic unthreatening human enemies. There are plenty of sharp, screeching musical cues or awkward moments where a cutscene will interrupt the flow of gameplay to show you a monster peekabooing around a corner. Or the very regular event of Pyramid Head popping up to flex his grotesquely large muscles and pretend to present any kind of threat before continuing on his journey through a solid brick wall. There is a doll that whispers behind you so that you can be shocked by a monster spawning from the ether to fuck you up, and a whole host of deeply unbalanced audio throughout the place that should be warning you of upcoming monsters but instead just bursts your eardrums if you're wearing headphones. And as a side note, do not wear headphones if you play this game on PC. So, Homecoming is a technical mess, the majority of its town is fundamentally no different to the titular Silent Hill, and it isn't scary. What else? Well, there is the fact that many aspects of this game are ripped entirely from other games within the franchise, and from the 2005 movie. The Silent Hill film, directed by Christoph Gans, is not a spectacular film by any stretch of the imagination, but one thing it absolutely got right was the atmosphere. This movie nailed the look and feel of Silent Hill, and whilst it took plenty of its own liberties with the lore of the series, squishing Pyramid Head in where he didn't belong, for example, and tripping over its own feet to remind us that Sean Bean was paid to be here every 15 minutes, at its heart it is a film made by someone who loved the games it was based on. Contrast it with the very different 2012 sequel, creatively titled Revelations, and it's quite easy to see why there are many people out there who consider 2005's film to be one of, if not the best video game to film adaptation. I've talked about this a lot before in many videos, so I won't go into great detail, but I genuinely enjoy the film for what it is, for its gorgeous visuals, and for the fascinating way it chose to interpret the transformation of Silent Hill into the nightmare world. And that vision was ripped straight from the film and tossed into Homecoming without much thought. On the one hand, seeing a real-time transition from the normal to the abnormal is great, both a testament to how far technology had come at the time, as well as a decent way of pulling the player into the universe. But on the other, it is downright lazy of the developers to not even try to make it look any different. The way that the world peels away like strips of flesh from a corpse, the way that black veins spread, mirrors break and blood oozes. There's an orange filter over everything as if there's an unending coal fire burning beneath the streets. Mechanical creaking and groaning that overwhelms any other attempts at building atmosphere. And even if I could forgive that, there are other aspects of the movie that have been crowbarred into the game. Barbed wire smothers everything for no particular reason, for example, or the fact that the game's entire hotel section has been lifted straight out of the film, up to and including the fact that in order to end the section you have to cut through a painting and use a special key to unlock the door into a bedroom where a child is hiding, except they aren't there anymore. There's an entire section set in a church whose layout is eerily similar to that of the film's own cultish hideout, and the latter quarter of the game sees you facing off against enemies who are wearing mining gear for no reason at all, because as far as I'm aware there is no mine in Shepherd's Glen or this game's version of Silent Hill. Speaking of the church, the game also features a sequence where you have to listen to someone you can't see in a confessional booth confess their sins and then decide whether or not to forgive them, which definitely did not happen in any of the other Silent Hill games before this. All of this demonstrates the stunning lack of originality that Homecoming has, and at least explains why it is considered the worst in the franchise, but lucky for you, I'm still not done, because despite all the aforementioned issues, there is still much more to this unnecessarily bloated game that needs to be discussed. So let's talk about a few small things that bother me first before we get to the biggest problem that the game has. In the PC version, the images of items and the map are glitched, which may have been caused by having a higher screen resolution but was not resolved by lowering said resolution to 1920 by 1080, meaning I had to rely on memory to get me around the town. Alex will stick his hand in a bloody broken window to get an ugly Robbie Rabbit stuffed toy, but won't stick the same hand under 2 inches of water to unlock a bolt on the bottom of his basement door. And what kind of door has a bolt on the bottom anyway? Is that an American thing? I don't know, let me know in the comments.
What's that guy doing?
He's digging a hole, you utter buffoon. The game is riddled with cutscenes to the extent that you will enter a cutscene, leave it, spend 5 seconds walking through a door and be greeted with another cutscene. Other times the game will interrupt you with a cutscene just to have a radio conversation where you stand around and wait for the other person to stop talking, something that really should have just been integrated into the game to encourage exploration, except there's nothing to explore. The worst example of this is when Alex wakes up in a jail cell after falling unconscious. You are forced to wait around in this locked cell until the next cutscene triggers, when it could just say, trigger the bloody cutscene and stop wasting my time. Why is this poster about prostitutes so prominently displayed? Why does Pyramid Head kill Adam? Why does nobody casually ask Alex why on earth he's wearing a soldier's uniform that isn't his? Why does this game have QTEs? This game makes you put on the stupid minor boiler suit for literally 30 seconds of gameplay and one whole cutscene, and then immediately takes it off again without explaining how that guy knew who on earth you were. Yes, that first aid kit will definitely save Wheeler. He is gonna be fine, guys. Okay, look, I've ragged on this game quite a lot now, and I should probably pause for a moment to give it at least the bare minimum of kudos before I go off the deep end with its fatal flaw, because, believe it or not, there are things that I do like, or at least appreciate, about Homecoming. I mentioned way back at the start of the video that this was the last game scored by the series' staple composer Akira Yamaoka, and his gift for atmospheric noise absolutely elevates this game far higher than it ever deserved. The Silent Hill soundtracks have always harboured an intensity and ingenuity that's difficult to describe. The way a piece of music makes you feel is something that's difficult to really put into words, but one thing that can be said is that Silent Hill's music has often broached the line between utterly horrifying and compelling. I would love to play some samples for you, but Konami are a funny bunch, so you'll just have to take my word for it when I tell you that the Silent Hill games would not be what they are today if it weren't for the soundtracks. Each game has its own distinct arresting style, with Yamaoka finally balancing the more noise-oriented pieces with the soft emotional pieces, and none of the games are more so indicative of his gifts than Silent Hill 2. From the complex, driving mechanical clanks of the Red Pyramid boss fight theme Betrayal, to the ugly, dissonant harmonies of A World of Madness, to the stunningly simple piece entitled True, Silent Hill 2 is as evocative of horror and madness as it is of loss and longing, and where the second game's soundtrack was focused on somber piano pieces for its emotional core, the third game features a selection of vocal tracks that took on an angsty teenage rage, perfect for Heather's fiery personality. For me personally, Homecoming is tied with Origins for the least memorable soundtrack of the series that was scored by Yamaoka, but that's not to say it has no merit. The low drones and tormented piano piece of Witchcraft evoke an unhappy upbringing and the sadness that comes with an unwanted son returning home. The Terminal Show, the track I remember most fondly from the game, plays whilst exploring the Shepherd family home, easily the most interesting section of the game both times it appears. We have the anything but cheerful Mr. Joy that features an undercurrent of simple but stark drums interspersed with bursts of static, and I will never complain about Yamaoka partnering with the inimitable Mary Elizabeth McGlynn. As I said, it's not the most memorable soundtrack given that much of it is obscured by the poor audio balancing, but the pieces that do stand out are great. Yamaoka's departure was greatly felt in Downpour, that's for damn sure. Something else I appreciate about the game are its bosses. Where the basic enemies receive very little imagination, the bosses seem to have siphoned it all off. Each boss is representative of one of Shepherd's Glen's murdered children, with each fight bearing a resemblance to the manner in which said child died, with one notable exception. There are 4 main bosses in the game: Sepulchre, representative of Joey, the mayor's son, who was buried alive; Scarlet, the doctor's daughter, whom he dismembered alive and is the only boss who shares its name with the child it is associated with; Asphyxia, representative of Nora Holloway, the judge's daughter, who was suffocated; and Amnion, the physical manifestation of the final failed offering of Joshua Shepherd. Considering how bare bones and basic the ordinary enemies are in Homecoming, their dull design honestly elevates the game's bosses all the more, because they are the only part of the game that really feels like any major effort went into their design. Sepulchre, being an archaic name for a burial chamber hewn from stone, is heaved out of the earth and crushes Joey's father into the dust he emerged from. Killing him is basic in terms of combat, but the symbolism of the fight itself is what is genuinely interesting. Much of his body bears a resemblance to tree roots, evocative of the garden where Mayor Bartlett buried his son, and the monster has a hideous gag in its mouth as if forced to consume endless chunks of earth. Scarlet is an enormous lanky humanoid reminiscent of a doll. During her boss fight, Alex must chip away at the glossy plastic exterior to reveal the flesh, tendons and sinew beneath, destroying her limbs piece by piece. Asphyxia's boss fight takes place in a gas chamber, which is hardly the pinnacle of symbolism, but she does have a pair of hands pressed firmly to her mouth, and in the final moments of her fight, Alex is able to kill her by viciously prying her hands away, forcing her to breathe. Amnion, the game's final boss fight, can be incredibly irritating given the creature's bizarre hitboxes and its habit of spitting goo at you from 1,000 miles away. Even so, the visual design, whilst odd at first glance, can be interpreted as a protective sac around Joshua, a mechanical womb in a fashion. Once destroyed, the sac splits and the corpse within is freed, freeing Joshua from his Schrödinger stasis. Don't get me wrong, the combat is still a massive pile of arse in the boss fights, but it's at least mitigated by the bosses themselves being visually interesting, upholding the lore of the game without having to shove it in your face, the way that it should be in a Silent Hill game. It's a shame that these bosses aren't in a better game. So, about that fatal flaw. I think by now it's fairly clear what I'm getting at, but the crux of it is this. Silent Hill Homecoming is a generic, run-of-the-mill Western horror game wearing the skin of a famous franchise in a desperate bid to reassure people that the franchise is in safe hands. It suffers from an abysmal plot whose fragile framework is supported by Hollywood romance cliches, escort quests, stereotyped characters, and deeply, profoundly ugly character models. It will hold your hand even when there is literally no possible way you could deviate from its path, and it absolutely does not want you to use your imagination. Everything in Homecoming is spelt out for you. You get a cutscene to show you where to go, get there, get another cutscene to make damn sure you know you need to enter that one specific building. It attempts the illusion of choice and consequence that was most prevalent in Silent Hill 2, but fails to understand that Alex didn't do anything to warrant the persistent screaming that he has a deep, dark secret. The protagonists in Silent Hill were always directly connected to the town, but this isn't Silent Hill, it's Shepherd's Glen, which is so thinly veiled in the first place that there's no reason at all why it shouldn't have just been a habitable part of Silent Hill. We already know from the second game that Silent Hill looks normal to the innocent, and we know from both 1 and 2 that the town was inhabited until relatively recently, with the hotel being in frequent use up until the point at which James returns. Even Shattered Memories and Downpour maintain this thread as canon. Homecoming went so far out of its way to be set outside of Silent Hill for no reason other than to try something new, all the while differentiating the towns in name only. At this point in time, there were still parts of Silent Hill that had never been seen in the games. Downpour itself would go on to imagine the then unseen southeastern corner of the city, with plenty of room for imagination. So look, we've already established that this game tries and fails to separate itself from its predecessors, creatively bankrupting itself in the first place, but there's also the issue of the story being so deeply preoccupied with a cast of characters who are either uninteresting, useless, or cartoonishly evil. To discuss this in more detail, let's have a quick rundown of what actually happened in Shepherd's Hill. Several centuries ago, the founders of Silent Glen left the Order of Silent Hill under the condition that each of the 4 families had to sacrifice one of their children every 50 years. This time around, the Bartlett, Holloway and Fitch families were successful, but the sacrifice for the Shepherd family failed as Joshua was killed, by mistake, when Alex had been chosen for the sacrifice. As a result of the failed sacrifice, the Order of Silent Hill are apparently reformed and have been kidnapping people to presumably use as sacrifices in an attempt to appease their god. Quite what the actual results of this failed sacrifice are, beyond the fog and the monsters, I don't know. There are no other major indications that the god is unhappy. The disappearances and deaths are all the result of the Order interfering. That said, they seem to have strange allegiances, since there's plenty of opportunity for the Order to murder Judge Holloway and that one weird mechanic guy, but they just don't, for some reason. So, the Order are responsible for the town's population going missing, but they elected not to punish one of the primary people responsible for their god being a little testy. Okay. The way that Joshua actually died is completely absurd, by the way. Not in the literal manner of his death, but rather in the way that it came about. For some bizarre reason that is never explained, Alex decided to wake his brother in the middle of the night and take him out into Lake Toluca on a rowboat. Whereupon they argue, get into a fight, and Joshua hits his head on the boat and falls into the water, drowning. Just why? Why did this have to happen at all? This is such a contrived explanation for how Joshua died. Why did Alex take him out into the lake in the middle of the night? He makes it sound like he had something important to tell him away from their parents, but if that's true, then you never find out what it is. It's all just a ridiculous way of having Joshua immediately act like an idiot and show the family ring to Alex, who then proceeds to turn into a monumental arsehole for essentially no good reason. Surely he must know by now that his father does not care for or about him, so it shouldn't be much of a surprise that Joshua has been given something this important. But this is by the by, there's no good reason whatsoever why Alex had to take Josh out to the lake other than trying to tie it into the fact that the Shepherd family sacrifice was meant to be a death by drowning. But if I'm being completely honest, I only realised that Josh was supposed to have drowned here when I reread the wiki summary of this dumpster fire of a game, because I have been assuming for the last 13 years that he died when his head struck the boat. And beyond this, it makes very little sense that Joshua's death would be the catalyst to Shepherd's Glen falling into darkness, since I highly doubt that an ancient, all-powerful god of some kind would truly, honestly care for who was sacrificed to it. And even if it did, the game is extremely clear that the children have to be killed by their parents, which Joshua was not. So Joshua's death causing any kind of problems could have been easily resolved by having Adam just drown Alex right there in the lake, right? Problem solved. And this, by the way, is somewhat hinted at in one of the game's absurd endings, although it's never really explained anyway, so it's pointless to even think about. But I have to ask, did none of the children of these families ever die in any peculiar ways before this point? Nobody ever had a horrible accident and thus upset the god because, I don't know, Mayor Bartlett's grandfather's third son, twice removed, died in a car accident instead of being buried under a giant tree? More than anything, the real problem with the game's ending is that it literally resolves nothing. The previous games always had a purpose to their resolutions. Harry kills the resurrected god, returning the purified a lesser to the world. James accepts his sins and the punishment that's due. Heather accepts herself and puts an end to the cult's attempts to resurrect their god again. And for all his broody melancholy, even Henry managed to prevent a lunatic serial killer from, returning to Mother. However, at the end of Homecoming, Alex kills the creature representing Joshua, accepts that Joshua is dead, and then just fucks off in the game's singular good ending. By the time Alex realises what actually happened, there's no one left alive to whom it matters anymore apart from him. Both his parents are dead, and neither of them really bothered to try to communicate the specifics to him even on their deathbeds, other than saying, "You're not actually a soldier, Alex." And as far as I can tell, he never says anything to Elle or Wheeler about the matter, so they will comfortably go about their lives, never questioning why Alex didn't actually rescue his kid brother, presumably. There's no resolution to the fate of Shepherd's Glen, no real evidence that the god was ever all that myth to begin with beyond the spooky monsters. And what exactly were they going to do in an empty town anyway? There's no exploration into who's running the order that was left in Silent Hill, given that they've now been systematically dismantled 3 times. No explanation for why they never tried to kill Judge Holloway. If she was leading them, then that's never proven at any point. There's no evidence to suggest that that's the case, she's just there. Surely it would have made more sense for Alex to sacrifice himself to appease the god. Since the town was empty anyway, it would have made the cycles of sacrifice and violence end with Alex's decision to give himself to the god, to set right the wrongs he never realised he committed and free the restless souls of Shepherd's sodding Glen. But we can't have that happen because that would ruin the perfect little Hollywood romance ending that we get to have, wouldn't it? Oh, and by the way, after you brutally slaughter Judge Holloway in this ridiculous QuickTime event, you can escort love interest Elle back to the room in which her mother is lying stone cold dead, in the middle of the floor, with a bloody great big drill hole in her chin, and she doesn't say a fucking word about it. Look, the story hasn't always been Silent Hill's strong point. The first game is an evil cult story, the third game is the same evil cult but way more interesting this time, and the fourth game is an interesting look into the psyche of the world's dullest hikikomori, but the game that matters in regards to Homecoming is Silent Hill 2. James Sunderland's story is often elevated as being the best in the franchise, and to be honest, it's for a good reason. Silent Hill 2 is dripping with layer upon layer of mystery, intrigue, metaphor, and analysis of grief, loss and repentance. It is beloved for a reason, and it is the game that every single one of the post-Team Silent developers have tried to emulate with choices and consequences as shallow as the depths of Konami's empathy. Because of its flawed interpretation of the source material, Homecoming's biggest downfall is the fact that it tries to present a difficult, disturbing story of mental stress, familial bonds, and the manipulation of children, but falls apart under the most basic of scrutiny. And even if the story was not full of holes, the game that surrounds it is so mind-numbingly underwhelming that engaging with it feels like a chore. A story that is, in many ways, this damn serious should not be lumbered with a token love interest and a sassy black cop stereotype. Silent Hill is a lonely place, and the depths of the darkness it reaches into aren't meant for the comedy relief of a wisecracking cop.
I'm gonna check it out first. We're not going that way.
It's a game that forces you to engage with human enemies, all voiced by one underpaid guy, that reincorporated the most hated elements of Silent Hill 4 on multiple occasions, that used Silent Hill as a crutch to tell a story that would have been better served in a completely different franchise, or a completely new IP. In truth, I think Double Helix likely did the best they could with the resources they were given. They were an inexperienced studio, given the reins to a hugely beloved franchise, and their legacy and imprint upon said franchise is an unfortunate footnote in an increasingly checkered past. They would go on to release just 6 more games, including reboots of Killer Instinct and Strider, before being bought by Amazon and integrated into Amazon Game Studios. If EA is the company to whom one points whenever corporate victims of the industry are brought up, then Konami is the company that one should point to when victims of corporate greed are discussed. Aside from its many, many alleged violations of basic workers' rights, Konami is so fundamentally against protecting and providing for the once beloved roster of games they've cultivated, that it is frankly astonishing that no one has successfully bought any of them. Castlevania, Silent Hill, Metal Gear, and Contra, to name but a few, have all been waylaid in some way by a company who simply do not care what their fans want. A company who unceremoniously threw their strongest cash cow out of the door and sent him straight into Sony's arms instead, who lost the master code to Silent Hill 3 and so had a third party piece the HD version back together with stitches and duct tape, who continuously handed off that very same franchise to unknown companies with little regard for the final product. A company who celebrated the franchise's anniversary with the announcement of hoodies, who plastered their beloved characters across pachinko machines, and who waved a dismissive hand in Dead by Daylight's direction when the decision was made to chuck in Pyramid Head and Heather, despite the two having nothing to do with each other and never appearing in a game together. The takeaway is this: Konami do not give a fuck about you. They don't care what you or I want, nor do they care about what their franchises deserve. And I know this is nothing new, Jim Sterling has been saying this for years after all. Silent Hill deserved better, but when looking back upon the many missteps that led to the nuclear apocalypse that was Silent Hill's cancellation, it's unsurprising that the franchise has been trampled into the dirt. And sadly, I think that's where Silent Hill will stay.